Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ganit Ankori, and I'm the Henry Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum and Professor of Fine Arts and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our land statement, which I hope everyone has had a chance to read and take in. Thank you. On behalf of the Rose Art Museum and the entire team, thank you for joining us for this evening's program, Desire at the Margins, Black Queer Representation, Intimacy, and Violence, co-presented with Fenway Health. Tonight's discussion is inspired by the themes explored within the Roses exhibition, Lyle Aston Harris, Our First and Last Love, which is on view through July 2nd. We do hope you will have the opportunity to visit the museum and see this really stunning exhibition. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, my colleague, Dr. Brandon Callender. Brandon Callender is an assistant professor of English at Brandeis, specializing in Black and queer literature. His scholarship and teaching explore how Black and queer writers, viewers, and players find affirmation in subcultures, genres, and spaces that often fail to acknowledge them. Professor Callender's fascinating book project, which I can't wait to read, is titled The Charge of the Other in Black Gay Men's Literature, and it examines eccentric expressions of desire and belonging that test the limits of respectability and solidarity. I'm delighted to welcome Brandon, who will introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you. Brandon, handing it off to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Ganit, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the team at the Rose Art Museum for mounting such an important exhibition and for planning this conversation with Fenway Health. It is my pleasure to introduce our two guests, Dr. Calvin Fitch and Adrianna Boulin. Calvin Fitch is a staff psychologist for Harvard Medical School and an affiliated investigator at the Fenway Institute. Through immersion in the LGBT community, Dr. Fitch helps Black, gay, and bisexual men protect their mental and sexual health by fighting their inner critics in the larger systems of oppression that feed the inner critic. Adrianna Boulin is the Director of Community Impact and Engagement at Fenway Health. In her role at Fenway Health, she supports the organization in enhancing the experiences of their patients, clients, and community, building a culture of authentic engagement. And it truly, truly is such a pleasure to be in conversation with y'all. There's so much we hope to accomplish in our brief discussion tonight. I want to spotlight our panelists and also our occasion for gathering to celebrate the Harris exhibit on display at the Rose. Though not much of our conversation tonight addresses Harris's work directly, it represents an effort to set into place a context for recognizing the importance for thinking about Black queer life today. My first thoughts upon visiting the Harris exhibit last week was the pleasure of seeing so many of the Black gay men and Black intellectuals I study featured in stunning contexts that dovetail with my own interest in Black gay men's literatures. His engagement with visual culture brought me back to this 1996 short story, Spice, by the author A. Cinque Hicks, who writes of gathering in the South for a meal of gumbo, and how it used to be the family tradition for everybody to bring along a little spice of their own to add to the dish. Like the inclusive metaphor of gumbo cooked up by the Black queer artist Marlon Riggs in his documentary Black Is, Black Ain't, and his face appears in the exhibit, this vision of gumbo presents Blackness as a complex dish that everybody can add to. But in the story, that isn't fully the case. The narrator discovers that grandma only pretends to add everybody's spices. Worse, he discovers that the photo he had sent her of his Black gay body marching shirtless in a pride parade has been hidden away from the family gathering in a drawer. As an act of revenge against the tradition that excludes him, the story ends with the narrator cutting up and adding to the gumbo the very photographs of Black queer life that they could not swallow. Thinking of the many others who were in this way left out of their traditions, Hicks writes, I cut another strip and then this one into seeds for the gumbo. They sat on top making brilliant violet constellations against the muted red of the food. And I thought there must be so many people you couldn't see behind those windows, dropping one by one into the stew. I could spice all the gumbo in the world. I feel the spice in the spirit of that vengeance in Harris's work. Whatever left behind photos of Black queer life might not have fallen into the stew, have perhaps wound up in one of his many collages featured in the exhibit. In a process that Harris describes as coming out of the shadows, he talks about finding ways to debut precisely these kinds of images and stories that are often regarded as inappropriate for public consumption by conservative strains of Black cultural politics. With collage, Harris writes, I was able to address the mutiny, the multiplicity of conflicting ideas that we embody. His portraits and collages foreground the tender private moments of Black queer life, but they also clash and rhyme those tender exposures with public images that entangle them within larger spectacles of state power and violence. As if to make us experience that conflict, he remixes public images of athletes or violent images of Abu Ghraib alongside sensual and pornographic images in ways that force us to confront the occasional overlap between the erotic life and the public life of power. In doing so, he allows us to think of how much fetishism, policing, surveillance, intergenerational trauma inform the erotic imaginaries and life worlds that Black queer people must navigate and in which, yes, they do arrive at pleasure. And it is here that we gather today to think about the cultural politics of Black queer life that insist upon joy, wellness, and a fantastic world of connections in the face of Fritz. As we shift now into conversation, we'll be covering a range of topics that investigate the way Black, queer, and trans peoples navigate mental and sexual health. And it is in that endeavor that I'm so happy again to have at my side Dr. Calvin Fitch and Adrianna Boulin to think through what these concerns look like on the ground from their respective positions at Fenway Health. Thank you again for being with us today, Al.
Happy to be here.
Wanted to maybe begin by giving y'all an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about your work.
Yeah, so I am a clinical psychologist by training, trained in health psychology. So a lot of my work tends to focus on people who are struggling with both some sort of mental health issue, depression, anxiety, but also chronic health issue. And on the research end, I kind of develop programs that help address the mental health and sexual health needs of Black, gay, and bisexual men. And I also operate a private practice. So just seeing clients for a range of issues. I do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, which kind of focuses on people's inner self-talk and how that kind of influences behaviors and how those behaviors might reinforce some of the mental health concerns that people come in with. So happy to be here. Thank you.
And hello, everyone. My name's Adrianna again, and I use the pronouns she and her. And my mission is to help create spaces where people can feel and be their authentic and healthy selves. And my work focuses on authenticity, healing, health equity, and community engagement. And what I've always been interested in since I was younger was what people needed. And I was always really passionate about finding facilitators to meet those needs and disrupting or dismantling the barriers that got in that way. And I get to do that at Fenway Health. There are a lot of projects that I lead that help us understand, first, clarify what impact, what is the need, and what are the priorities? What impact are we making now? What impact do we aim to make? And how do we facilitate that? So I love how my role focuses on what's connected to my own personal deep mission. And I also am the president of Boston Pride for the People, which is the organization that is leading the organizing of the annual Boston Pride Parade and Festival. And that work has been so connected to identifying a need and finding a way to meet or facilitate that need. There's a need for a parade and festival in Boston that is anti-racist, that is inclusive, that is accessible, and that is community-centered. And it was work that those were needs that were advocated for and continue to be. And as a community, we've now come together to meet that. And that's really the mission of Boston Pride for the People. And again, very connected to who I am and the work that I do. And this is what's on my heart right now. What has helped me do this work is just connecting my own personal journey to the work that I do and the personal journeys of the lives of people who we all work to support.
So I thank y'all for that so much. And maybe I'll just take up from there, where one thing that stands out to me, both in the ways that y'all are responding to the different needs that the communities you serve have, is about navigating risk and about how much need and desire and feeling confident and safe enough to go out and pursue them is related to the strategies and networks we have for navigating those risks. And so I just love to hear a little bit about what it looks like to be able to grow that flourishing life of desire and be able to pursue those needs. Knowing some of the risks that a lot of Black, queer, and trans youth are up against.
You want to go first, Calvin, or would you like?
Yeah, sure. So obviously a lot of my work focuses on risk. And I think risk in the sexual context, which can get a little complex, because I think a prominent emotion that comes up for people who might have sexual desires that maybe don't fit into the whole respectability politics. The prominent emotion that comes up is shame. And shame is that thing that's like different than embarrassment. Embarrassment is like you're ashamed of something you did, but shame is like you are ashamed of who you are. And so I see my role as helping people to recognize when that shame self-talk is coming up. I shouldn't be this way, I shouldn't do this, things like that, and to help give them the antidote to shame, which is self-compassion. So in light of all of this, how can you still be respectful to yourself, and how can you give yourself some understanding in all of this? And I think a prominent behavior in shame is to hide yourself. And so how can you be open, do the opposite, and let this be something about you that is known, with the recognition that sometimes these things are things that can put people in danger. So we want to do that effectively. And, one way to do that might just be, coming out, being open. But another way to do that more discreetly is sometimes through art. And that's why I think this is so important. And because you can take a message that's really central to you and relay it, and have other people understand it. So that's kind of the way that I see some of this sometimes coming up in my work.
Yeah, thank you, Calvin. And something I'm thinking about is a conversation that I had recently with a group of our cohort members at Fenway Health that are a part of the Activist Academy. And we were talking about telling your story and how vulnerable telling your story can be and feel. And we broke down, or I shared rather, my definition of vulnerability, and it's expressing yourself and exposing yourself to a range of possibilities. And I say a range of possibilities because it can be possibilities, opportunities, outcomes that are in alignment with you. And it can be possibilities that are out of alignment and may come with outcomes or a range of feelings that bring harm to you, physical or psychological. And so I feel in my work, one thing that I focus on as we engage with community, I talked about before how it's important for me to create spaces where people can be their authentic and healthy selves and also thrive. And something I talk a lot about in community is to live the beliefs that support your desires. And I appreciate, Calvin, you talking about you differentiating between shame and embarrassment, and also sharing what shame causes in an individual and how that impacts their expression of their desires. And so I like to create a space where individuals feel affirmed and where safety is promoted, in creating an environment where an individual can discover their desires and believe and maintain beliefs that support it. So just connecting to what Calvin mentioned, creating a space where someone feels empowered to identify with a desire, and also affirm themselves in that.
And I thought that related so well into like the story about the gumbo, besides the fact that I really love gumbo. It really kind of like, there was two choices that could be made. You could have left the pictures out of the gumbo, which would have equated to kind of hiding and not letting your story be told. But then it's like to be almost a little bit disruptive, right? And put your story in there because it matters and because it's something that should be celebrated. And so I think that really resonated with me personally. And also I think relates to this, discussion of telling your story and being open, because a lot of times those are the stories that get hidden. When we started talking about the AIDS epidemic and things like that, it was a white gay disease. And then slowly, Black people started being integrated, but it wasn't gay and bisexual Black people. It was just, and so then, so I think, making sure that you tell your story so that it doesn't get left behind, because it should be celebrated.
Yes.
I have so much I'm responding to in this. I think that one thing that comes up, so I'll tell a story alongside it, and then I have a question that grows out of two of your contributions. One of them is a moment I love in one of the authors, Samuel Delaney's thinking about what James Baldwin, as a Black queer writer, does for his identity. And he's reading Baldwin's story, and he just has this moment of reckoning. He's like, what Baldwin wants is not what I want. And now it's my time to go tell my own story of what I want. And I think so much of this idea of coming out of the shadows and navigating, a world beyond shame, being able to match, I forgot how you put it so wonderfully before, Adrianna, but like be able to like identify with your desires or whatever it might be. I think of how important it is for producing a bustling, varied world of desires, which you might find your way to. My question is, and maybe, I don't know if it's a difficult one, but has to do with picking up on something you said, Adrianna, in terms of authentic and healthy selves, where in terms of thinking of the sort of self-compassion that you're reaching towards, Calvin, with the folks you're working with, I wonder what happens or how you engage moments where what folks desire perhaps feels like it is not working in alignment with pursuing that which feels safe or that which feels or is regarded as healthy, maybe if I could put it that way. I could give an anecdote to help ground that if it helps, but I'll pause there just to see what comes up. But yeah, what does it mean to be able to think about desires, where sometimes where it leads you is into grounds that might question your safety or perhaps move you out beyond the brink of respectability politics. Perhaps we'll say it that way.
Do you want to go, Adrianna, first?
Sure. And to clarify, the question is, when we engage with individuals or when we ourselves may have navigated that, how do we support that? How do we approach? Can you clarify a little bit more?
That's right. So in the sense of one of the stories I work with by this writer, G. Winston James, is him actually, his stories are largely autobiographical. It's him thinking about his interactions with his therapist and how the life his therapist wants for him as a healthy life does not match with what he himself wants as a Black gay man. And it's cruising, and not just cruising, but also things that, again, entangle shame, the desire to be, the object of violence in the spirit of play, these sorts of things. And so in those regards, I just wonder what do those conversations or that outreach look like when it feels like maybe what someone wants for themselves or what feels authentic to them feels like it is concerning or feels like it bucks against larger conceptions of what is healthy or safe?
Yeah, thank you for that. When I think about engaging community and creating spaces where people feel empowered to identify, to me, it's they can identify internally and not say anything to me, or they can express it. And so what I aim to do is to create what I aim to do, and what I work with other people to support is people having a space where they can identify themselves. And I guess I'm saying that to say, to me, it's more important that you yourself understand your desires, and less that you feel right away that you're able to communicate or bring it out into the world. And there is a time, of course, I think, where it's important for you to bring it out in the world. I think that's that's continuing the journey of existing in a thriving and loving way. And so some of the ways where I try and do that is I tell my story. I've found it helpful to share with people my own journey. I've had desires that have gone against what is people regard as normal or right. I've had moments, the example that you just gave, Brandon, I've had moments where I've been sitting with my therapist feeling like, I want to say this, and it's like, I'm not feeling that. And I support other people feeling comfortable in sitting with what they might feel inside and not necessarily having to align it, connecting with outside, by sharing my own story. I think sharing my own story is really the tool that I use. And it might not always work, but I think there are a range of tools. And one, just creating a space where someone feels like where you're open and non-judgmental, that comes from body language, that comes from your presence, that comes from your countenance. So that's one way. Another way is sharing your story where an individual is like, wow, okay, I see, like something like that is okay. So those are two approaches that I'd offer, but I think there are many tools in the toolkit.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. I loved the point about being open and about admitting that you yourself, have this sometimes, because that can be sometimes so powerful for the people that I work with, is just to say, like, look, this is something that is to normalize it a little bit, So I love that. Also, so since we're at I notice with a lot of artists, they feel things intensely, right? And that's why a lot of, especially the good ones, they feel things more intensely than other people, because you've got to translate this from through multiple mediums to get somebody to understand it, right? And so a lot of times it can be wrapped up in the feeling. This feels this way. And that's what's called emotion mind. And so because I feel this way, it must be. Because I feel ashamed, it must be that way. So sometimes I like to, because people are so far into emotion mind, I like to bring them back concretely. Tell me in words why it is that you feel this way, and what's coming up for you in terms of thoughts when you're faced with this situation, or when somebody asks you about this, or when you have to identify this way. And a lot of times just by writing it out and writing out your own thoughts, you can see, oh my God, I am not being compassionate with myself at all. Like, would you say that to the person who you love the most? Probably not. So what would you say to them? And why can't we move that to you? Why does that not apply to you? And exploring that a little bit more. So I think it's really important to kind of stay in that kind of medium between, that reasonable kind of mind, and also that emotion mind that's hot and quick, and like, this is the way that I feel, so that must be the way that it is.
That is such a helpful phrase. I am going to have to do a whole bunch of Googling after this session. I guess one thing I'd love to ask, jumping out from there in terms of emotional mind, again, I've never heard of this, but thinking about legacy trauma a little bit. And one thing that stands out to me is there's a novel I love, Darker Reflections by Samuel Delany, and it's this Black gay man who's his most imaginable, robust world of desire that he wants. He never actually pursues it because he's so scared of, the risks he has to navigate, particularly related to HIV/AIDS as well. And so I'm just thinking in terms of that had such an impact I know on myself growing up, where the first person who, one of the first people who recognized me as being in the closet was a white woman who said, you're Black and you're gay, you're double fucked, you're definitely getting AIDS. And I remember being terrified of my sexuality for years, to the point that it was something I avoided because that lived in me, that fear. It was almost like it was in my body already, right? And so I think of the conversations y'all have opened up around shame and about sort of creating these enabling spaces. And I just wonder how much this practice works with folks who are struggling with those legacies of trauma that are stretching back through, I think particularly the immense period of loss in the 1980s. That's very important to my work. So I just love to hear on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I love talking about this topic. Early on in my career, I did some research. It was with pregnant women who were depressed and low income. And it was about stress and the way that stress can affect the baby. So when we're chronically stressed, we release this hormone that's called cortisol, which has all these negative effects on the body and things like that. Leads to all kinds of different disease, and also affects, another effect of that is kind of this emotional, you have a higher baseline. You tend to have a more emotional reactivity. So they found that the women who were more stressed out, especially during their pregnancy, actually gave birth to babies with higher cortisol and higher stress hormones. And so I think just way back, like slavery, okay, these women are giving birth to, babies with higher stress hormones and more emotional reactivity. Plus you throw in now, like today's political context and things like that. And sometimes there's, that higher, I think, reactivity to sorts of things. And I think that's how there can be kind of this generational trauma that just kind of gets carried on. But I think the same concepts work. These are things that you can break out of. It's a nature and nurture thing. So relearning that relationship with yourself and with the emotion of shame and not owning that when it doesn't need to be owned. And kind of just, working through that and forming new narratives and new sort of core beliefs that challenge kind of that old stuff.
Yeah, and I was just sitting with a documentary that I had the opportunity to be a part of called Black, and it featured the history of Black queer Bostonians from, I believe, the early 70s or 80s to present day. And I'm sitting with that because what has been particularly healing when I think about generational trauma or legacy trauma, particularly in the QT BIPOC community, has been intergenerational interactions, both intra-generational and intergenerational conversation. The conversation within the generation is really helpful. Let me explain, let me think about why. It's helpful to speak with individuals within the generation to see where our experiences align and to support each other in conversations that are intergenerational. And maybe I'm only speaking from my personal experience, but it was helpful to process and be present and participatory and action oriented, I don't know if that's the word I want to use, in intergenerational spaces when I did the work within myself and within our generation to understand what it would look like to heal intergenerationally. And I think what's healing for me in those spaces is seeing that experience in the life of an individual that came before me, and seeing how somehow seeing the experience in a previous generation with an individual helps me understand what might facilitate us having more empowering and thriving experiences. So I would say that intergenerational connection, and just connection in general, because I started with intra-generational. So just connection in general, but it's important to both be within the generation and across the generations.
This is lovely. This is something that's coming up in between both of your contributions. And I think it has to do with the question that comes to mind in terms of intergenerational passing down of trauma is also, someone put this in a podcast, but like, can Black folk also pass down happiness? Does the reverse apply? And I think the question that I have about that, like, and it's sitting at the level of the intergenerational connection, is I think of this beautiful archive that Black queer writers have left us for thinking about imagining happy futures. And one of the folks who comes to mind, Essex Hemphill, who I know is in the Lyle Ashton Harris exhibit, who talks about like these thick, wet-lipped Black knights cruising in the village. And y'all are probably maybe familiar with Jericho Brown, but he has this lovely poem, which is titled after Essex Hemphill, where he talks about, even though I know the night, there's so much risk out there, and even though I know what happens to queer folks of color, he says, the night is my right. Shouldn't I eat? Shouldn't I repeat? This sense of, you know, this beautiful fruit you still want to go after. And I guess the questions are maybe at the situated between two things. The first one I'll ask, I'll come back to the second one, it has to do with intergenerational, is one, like, what are the sort of strategies in terms of these intergenerational connections, the aesthetics, the arts, the practices, all of it, that you see getting passed down, whether just intergenerationally through Black folks, or through like Black queer ancestors, elders? What do those practices look like to allow us to think of, yeah, our inheritance is something more than passing down those traumas?
Ooh. Calvin, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think about, like, if trauma can spread through a community, we must also be able to spread growth. And there is a concept called post-traumatic growth, wherein people experience, it's more than, we often hear the term resilience, which means you can bounce back from things, but this is you get knocked down and you have to rebuild your world in a different way that ends up being more complex, more nuanced, and serves you better than that previous definition. But you never think that you're gonna get there, you know? And so one thing that comes up is, you start to think differently about your relationships with other people and what closeness can mean, right? That could be an example of that. And so I think about Black people and like how I have people that I call my cousins that aren't even blood related to me, right? But like that concept of we can share a bond that's like family, even though we're not related. That's not something that's taught to you. That's something that's passed down and learned. And that comes from trauma, you know, not having certain people around, and needing to kind of pick up resources to figure out what you can do, you know? You start to see new possibilities for things. You have a certain appreciation of life that's different from what other people have, an appreciation of the moments that you do have, and how to really maximize those moments and get the most out of them. So I think about like Black celebrations and like how it's just such like, it's a production and it's a community event. There's a lot of closeness in multiple directions. And spirituality and what that looks like and how that can be complex. It doesn't have to be sometimes this traditional, what we think of, like there's nuances to it, and there's different ways, and people have different relationships with, whatever higher power that they believe in. So I think, and the people who embody that, those are the voices that I feel need to be lifted up sometimes in our community, because I don't feel that somebody should have to come to a $200 an hour psychologist to learn those concepts. They should be able to go down the block, chat with their friend, and be inspired by this journey and have a roadmap of how to get there. So that's what I think.
I love that. What comes to mind to pass down is just a general sense of openness. Something I've seen a lot in the QT BIPOC community as it relates to struggles with feeling affirmed is this feeling of shame. Just we are expressing differently as humans, and somehow that different expression brings about feelings of not being affirmed. And just, I feel like that openness being passed down generationally would do so much difference. And the other thing I'm thinking of in my mind comes with conditions or is nuanced, and it's meeting failure with less fear, or just meeting failure with excitement, or seeing it as part of the process. And why I say it's nuanced or comes with conditions is we all have the different access to be able to experience fear in a less scary way. Like some of us, not fear, failure. Some of us fail, and the outcome of our failure will be different because of our access, our socioeconomic status, the privilege or power that we have. And so I want to acknowledge that. Just speaking from my own experiences and experiences of other individuals in our community, I've been so scared to fail. And I think to fail at or to just be wrong. And I think that has impacted in the past, just my ability to be open and explore. And so I think part of joy is the ability to explore and try things and learn. And I think failure, feel like in our community, especially in the Black community, and other communities of color, you always hear you have to work twice as hard, et cetera, et cetera. So failure it feels like, and it also, we experience it as that much harder. I guess I'm just thinking about, I'd love for us to be able to experience failure and see it as an opportunity. We're learning to see it as a part of the process. So openness and the ability to approach failure and see it as an opportunity and not as a detriment. But first we need to get the world to a place where it really isn't a detriment, because it could be for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of thinking of clients I work with that are dealing with government services and needing to go submit this form, and then you go and submit it, and oh, this is not right, you have to do this again, or no, you're supposed to go to this person instead. And it's like failure at and all they're trying to do is get housing or get food or all of these different essential needs, and so they're hitting failure at every single thing, but they keep going, right? And sometimes it's because we've seen somebody who's had to do that, right? I know somebody personally in my family who's had to do that. So it kind of inspires me and gives me context too, and puts things in perspective when I'm struggling with my academic thing. But when I was little and my family was struggling with just basic needs. So helps me contextualize, and also helps me sometimes to just really harness that personal strength. I think part of that has been passed down from people in my family who've faced challenges, and also me witnessing that. So
I'm going to keep making book plugs, I think, just because they're rhyming so much with what y'all are talking about. Marvin K. White, a fantastic Black queer poet and pastor. I'm thinking of the spiritualism that you brought up as well. Has this wonderful book, Our Name Be Witness, where he talks about, his mother and his grandmother both having Alzheimer's and having to be there to receive and carry forward their stories. And so the whole idea of having to be the names that they call out who aren't there to be there with the women, he takes on those names and writes their stories. But within that archive, as you're saying, of intergenerational passings down, there's so many different like recipes, advices, pick-me-up stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are channeling into a Black queer archive, this wonderful, like maybe it's that voice of self-compassion you were talking about earlier, Calvin, about like drawing upon the ancestors to be that voice for how you might move forward. So I'm growing with that. I wonder, maybe just because it's in the room, if spiritualism and thinking about Black queerness and spirituality feels worth exploring. I also think there's another great book, Spirited, Affirming the Black, Lesbian, and Gay Soul, by G. Winston James and Lisa Moore, which is a beautiful multi-faith anthology looking at how Black queer folks have found belonging, claimed belonging in various faiths. So I want to make that plug. But I'm wondering what that looks like in your advocacy, your work, your outreach, if that speaks to you.
Yeah. I want to sit with that for a moment. Calvin, are you open to going first, or would you like to sit with that too?
We could also bring it back to Joy, because I also have a lot of questions on what y'all.
Well, I love this question. I just feel like, gosh, there's so much.
Well, one thing that comes up,
go ahead.
I think a lot of times, I was gonna kind of mention this earlier, is that a lot of the stories of Black queer men have just been obscured, just written over. Adrianna and I attended the Bayard Rustin community breakfast, right? And he was one such individual, right? Like, who was critical in the civil rights movement, but you don't hear his name mentioned because of respectability politics. We can't have a gay man being the face of this because they won't let us move forward. So we need you to kind of take an L while we move forward and like think about who gets left behind. And I think the biggest impact sometimes has been on queer youth, because there's no one in history where there are people, but you've just never heard of them. You don't learn about them in history books. So there's nowhere to really solidly anchor yourself in history, right? I can anchor myself as a Black person. I can anchor myself kind of as a gay person, but as a Black gay person, it's harder, right? And so sometimes having the discussion, and this is something that I'm thinking about how I want to integrate within my HIV prevention program, because I think it's really important, but faith that's affirming, and whatever that looks like to you, that does not have to mean God, that could mean nature, that could mean the universe, but something, anchoring yourself in something, because sometimes just the spiritual anchoring, since, sometimes the history is lacking, I think can be very helpful. And so that's something that I sometimes discuss with people is like, what do you believe in that's beyond yourself? What transcends kind of where we are at present, but like a higher power. And sometimes that can be a good beacon to help you make decisions or offer yourself the self-compassion and things like that, as you might be kind of navigating shame around things that you like. So that I find to come up in my work and be helpful.
Something you said got Siri excited, so she cut you off for a moment. I heard most of it. If you saw my eye gestures, that was me responding to Siri asking me what she could do for me.
You said something that I really agree with, Calvin. Well, I agreed with everything that you said. You mentioned you see value, you see importance in everyone having something to anchor onto. And I feel exactly the same. I feel like there's a light that everyone can anchor onto. And as I get to get to know people and explore what their needs are, something that I like to get to know about them is what is their light? What is their universe? What is their God? What is that for them? And that helps understanding that and centering that helps inform how I engage with individuals. So I love asking, what inspires you? What motivates you? Who motivates you? What centers you? A lot when I engage with individuals or we have workshops with community members, these are questions that I like to ask individuals to share or just reflect on themselves. And that helps inform how you engage with an individual. If someone shares a particular faith or practice that resonates with them or practices, that helps frame and shape how we might engage with them.
Yeah, I could be in conversation all night. I know we're at question time.
Oh my goodness, that much.
We are. I still have more I would like to ask, but maybe let's pause here and see if any questions come up from the audience. And if not, we'll keep chatting.
This isn't a question as much as a request, but we have had a comment from the audience that, Brandon, you have shared so many wonderful literary sources, and would it be possible, I'm asking you now, would it be possible for us to put together a reading list as a follow-up of all the sources that you mentioned tonight? That would be a great follow-up to send to our participants.
Yeah, I would love to. And to speak on what Calvin was saying before, much of the work I've been doing from undergraduate up features on a lot of out-of-print Black gay men's anthologies and poetry collections. And it breaks my heart in that tradition to find that, inevitably you flip to the end of the books and find how many of these men have passed from AIDS complications and how many of them are out of print, particularly within our tradition. You have, Melvin Dixon charging audiences to remember him. He says, "You are charged to call our name. If you don't buy our books, they'll go out of print." And sadly, a lot of them have gone out of print. And so I think that's a tradition very close to my heart. So I'm happy to set out there some names that y'all might look into. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your interest.
So there aren't any other questions. I think people are taking it all in, but I wondered if, I heard the phrase "to tell your story," and you talked about archives. And, Lyle Ashton Harris is really archiving his life. There are photographs that he uses from as a baby, and then as a child, and then as an adolescent, and all his loves and lovers until his very last self-portraits, but also his community. So he creates this self-portrait that's also a collective community portrait. But also going back to his family. And he talks about archiving, not just telling his story, but kind of archiving. And I'm wondering if, based on everything that I heard from all of you, this feeling that queer Black folks are sometimes not just marginalized, but invisibilized. And during the AIDS crisis, as you just said, Brandon, they're lost. Maybe archiving is an instinct to save and make sure that things aren't lost, that things are alive, to keep them alive and to make them as significant as they are.
If I could just shout out briefly, Stephen Fullwood, the former archivist for the Black, Lesbian, and Gay archives from the Schomburg Center. I went to him to do a work on the first ever Black gay anthology in the life by Joseph Beam in 1986. And I was an undergrad. I was like, I want to work in this. He's like, "See, brother, I have a problem with that, because if you want to work in this, you need to know the tradition." And he gave me, in return for service, book after book of out-of-print anthology to look into. But that to say, I recognize, as Calvin was speaking into, how much erasure and intentional erasure has gone into making these histories so difficult to access. I mean, in terms of Black gay men, literally being put in broom closets when asking for queer organizing, could we have space for a writing group? That was what they were given. Mm-hmm. And so I think in that regard too, I just want to acknowledge and celebrate how many folks have done the work of archiving and organizing, as the folks I'm in conversation with today, to keep that history in circulation and to, right. So it's maybe it's an insistence upon joy, or what we have done, I think, also in that, because I mean, if y'all have not seen the Lyle Ashton Harris exhibit, I experienced an immensity looking at it. I felt like however to do diligence to this, it's Yeah, I'll pause there, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to say that the alternative in terms of art forms is the Watermelon Woman, where both Cheryl Dunny and I'm blanking out on her name, the artist who did the photo archive, because there was no record, there was no history, there were no photographs of the Black actresses that she was wanting to research. She just had to invent the narrative. There's another interesting question that I'm just going to read verbatim from Isaiah Hill. How do you help with Black queer folks wanting to exist and be authentic, but feeling like they can't because they cannot take space, either due to their Blackness or queerness? I know it's something I've grappled with as a younger queer Black person who didn't have as many role models as my non-Black white peers.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your question. I'm happy to share, and I invite others after. I'm thinking about my own experience, Isaiah. Before, I've always had desires as a queer person, always, but never felt like I had access to or could even identify that way. And what really helped me honestly explore that, I came out to most of my family 2 summers ago, and I'm 32 years old. And what helped me was really representation and working at Fenway Health. I don't want to think about what would happen if I didn't start working at Fenway Health, but being around queer people, being in a space where we're thinking about being and feeling affirmed all the time is what helped me. And I didn't really have exposure to that in any other space, in work, in a friend group, in church. And so as an example, in church, and we're coming on time, I was like, we need a part 2 of one of these. But what I will say is some of the work that I've done has been active in the Black Ministerial Alliance so that we can have representation and information in front of people. And so we've created videos and resources and had community meetings and have met after services so that people have that information, that representation, so they have the opportunity to access it. So that's one thing that I'd offer.
I guess I could share personally too. Like, I felt like this when I came to Boston. I felt a ton of racism, but covert racism, not overt, which was worse because it made me gaslight myself into, coming up with alternative explanations for other people's racist behavior. I felt like I couldn't take up space. I felt like I didn't deserve to take up space. This wasn't my place. And one thing that I did was I changed contexts. So for me, international travel has been so important. And I realized that not everybody can just, travel like that, but I think it just generally means changing context, getting to a place where you feel like you can take space, even if that's, a small space that's more space than what you are taking up currently. But, sometimes there's barriers that you have to break through to get there. And so one thing that I had to break through was social anxiety. I was terrified to travel alone, terrified to go to a club alone by myself. And I remember one day I just booked the ticket and I was like, I'm locked into it. I guess if I freak out, I'm just gonna go to restaurants only. I won't interact with anybody. But it ended up being such a transformative experience for me. I felt beautiful. I felt empowered. I felt capable, worthy. And so that's something that I always take with me, is this importance of changing context.
I think that's we're at time. I think that's such an important message to be able to go out on. I would say just, again, take as much space as you can. I always joke, my mom always said, I looked better in colors that helped me blend in. and I have taken that aesthetic and I have tossed it. And so I think in that regard, being able to take up space fabulously and to be able to grow into what feels right for you. And I thank y'all again, Adrianna and Calvin, for thinking so much with us about how we can help grow those spaces for Black queer folks to be able to take up the space we deserve, you know? So thank you. I've been so grateful to be in conversation with y'all.
Same here.
Thank you. It's been great.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Good night.